I'm so happy to see so many people today. We see that there are about 57 participants, and I know it's early in the afternoon, so we should have some more, hopefully, as the meeting progresses. But this is our first part of a two-part conversation that we want to have with you all about key questions and priorities related to mobility. And we are going to try to stay on time till 5. The next slide, Bobby. Just some housekeeping. We are going to be using some polling today. If you're unable to do that, just use the chat or raise your hand. You will also be able to raise your hand if you have a question, and you can put your question in the chat as well. And I want you to know that because some people are asking, they're muted right now and they can't talk because we're in a webinar format, and that's part of the webinar format. Your answer and commenting options really are in the bottom menu, what you're showing on screen. Bobby will hit enter a couple of times and pull some highlights up for you. So you've got the chatting, the raising your hand. You can do Q&A if you want, but we really want to leave everything in the chat today so we can see it all. It'll also be easy for us to grab the chat when we're done with today's meeting so we can incorporate it into the meeting summary. And then if you need to leave at any reason, just go ahead and click that red button, but we hope you stay for the whole thing. Let's go to the next slide. So we're really interested to see how well y'all can use the polling features today. And so Beth is going to pop up a poll question for you. We know that this is our first mobility session where we've had everybody from the public come to participate that's interested, but we also know there have been other strategy sessions, particularly for visibility last month. So I'd love to know today if you've participated in any of the Playbook strategy sessions before today. Answer options are yes or no. You should be able to just use your mouse or your finger if you have a touch screen to click yes or no.
Almost got all our votes in, Travis. Missing about 5, so I'll give it about 5 more seconds here, and I'll end it and share. Sharing the results now.
Okay, it's half and half almost. But mostly no, we've got 30 no's and 28 yeses, and we've gained a few people since we've opened the meeting. So that's really helpful because we have some review information that we need to go through today. And so for some of you that have heard it before, just bear with us. And for the new people, I hope this is new and fresh for you. Let's go to the next slide. So here's our agenda, Bobby.
Hey everybody, I'm Bobby Evans. I'm a staff planner with the Long Range Division, and I'm going to tell you what we're going to tell you. So today we're going to reiterate a little bit about the purpose of the mobility sessions. We're going to do some background sort of context setting about comprehensive planning, what the transportation element of the comprehensive plan is, and what we've heard so far. Then we're going to go in on a discussion. The theme of the discussion is, how far should we go with mobility in Kansas City? It's a little cheeky, but we're really trying to get a temperature check on, we've heard priorities, the same things for the last 15 or so years, but we want to know how deep, how extensive should these policies go, just to get a real sense of the types of policies we should craft for the plan. And then we're going to talk a little bit about next steps and another element of the mobility strategy session cycle. So the purpose of these strategy sessions is essentially to guide the direction for multimodal transportation. Comprehensive plans are on about a 20-year time horizon. And so we need you to be thinking big and also locally about which direction transportation should be headed in Kansas City for the next 20 years. So that citywide big picture view is really important, but also think about this in terms of how it's going to affect your life, how it might look on your street, in your neighborhood, on your way to work. Another thing we're looking for is to voice the issues, values, and priorities from your perspective. So yeah, you can think about what's good for everybody, but what makes sense for you and what do you want to see? So it's a little bit of push and pull and, multiple scales there. We can't come up with everything. So we really do need help identifying challenges, opportunities, and implementation pathways for these policies. And lastly, we would love for you to act as a champion for plan adoption. We're all part of the decision making here and crafting this plan. And so we're hoping you feel some ownership and some agency here. And then as it goes forward, we can count on you to act as a champion for the plan. So just to reiterate, so it looks about like half of you have been in a meeting before, so half of you haven't. So I'm sorry if this is a repeat for at least 50% of the folks out there. But so the KC Spirit Playbook, it's an update to the existing comprehensive plan, which was done in 1997. And that plan was called Focus. It sets priorities and guides land development for about the next 20 years. Like I said, Focus from 1997 was a really big deal. It resulted in a lot of the downtown redevelopment, streetcar, Kansas City, the Power and Light District, a lot of historic reuse, and really set the stage for what we've seen as the growth that has inspired so many people to sort of reignite their love for the city in the last several years. That started way back in the 90s. So we're ready to look forward and sort of redo that process and have you shape what the next 20 years are going to look like. In terms of schedule, so we are here right in the middle. We started off in 2019 with some pre-planning. We hope to end the process and publish the plan in 2022. We're still on target to make that happen. So right now we're in this listening, we're a little bit past the preliminary analysis and listening phase. We're in vision and goal creation. So we're talking to folks about where we want to be, the types of policies we should have to create the community we want to have. Then we're going to do some goal item review, sort of come up with some goals, run them through the community. Then after that, it's essentially project delivery, drafting the plan, refine it, finalization, adoption by the end of 2022. So there's multiple elements in a comprehensive plan, transportation being one of them. If you attend other strategy sessions, you'd know that we're talking about things such as right now, we've been talking about visibility as well, concurrent with mobility. So that's things like urban design, public spaces, parks, historic preservation. So we're doing visibility and mobility at the same time, but we're also looking to talk about serviceability and livability, infrastructure, maintenance, city services, things of that nature. And all of these topic areas and the ideas that get created in these meetings get run through what we're calling the Empowerment Committee, which is another group of folks who are devoted to looking at things from another sort of bigger picture view. And the two really big goals for this mobility element are to create strong links to other plan elements, land use and public health and things like that. Transportation kind of touches everything and everything touches transportation. And also we're looking to take all of the various elements of transportation recommendations and plans throughout the city and create a singular transportation vision for the next 20 years. Just a real quick note about the schedule for the strategy sessions. We're right here with the mobility strategy session in July. We're gonna have another one in August, September, October, and November. Starting in the fall, we're gonna be working on fall through winter is livability and serviceability. And we're have one more or two more strategy sessions, I believe, for visibility. So in terms of the way these things work and the hierarchy of ideas for the comprehensive plan, we start off with, the vision of where we want to be, the values of what we believe in, and the goals of what we would need to achieve to get there. That's sort of the purview of the Empowerment Committee. Where we're at is in this sort of gold area, the objectives, actions, strategies, and implementation and metrics. So we're looking at specific outcomes and actions to achieve those objectives. Should have done some warm-up exercises today. So yeah, that's where that sort of high level, but also granular vision comes in that we're trying to get after. And now I'm going to hand it over to Jay to talk about some of the stuff that we've been hearing for a while about transportation in Kansas City.
Thanks, Bobby. Hi, I'm Jay Aber with the engineering and planning consultant firm WSP and helping out with the project. So Bobby had mentioned the focus plan from 1997, and this is really the foundation of where we've come from over the last almost 25 years. And the focus plan was a big paradigm shift in how we think about and talk about transportation. It was really ahead of its time in 1997. And it recognized that a lot of our neighborhoods, very active neighborhoods or community centers that were historically very active at a street level had been replaced with automobile-oriented developments. And a lot of times those investments in streets and highways had been detrimental to pedestrian, bicycle, and transit mobility. The focus plan was talked a lot about multimodal mobility, how we needed to shift away from private vehicle use and driving to these these other modes of transportation, walking, biking, transit, for sustainability, resiliency, equity, other reasons. And so that quote down at the bottom, you can see that they say that transportation must link people to jobs, recreation, medical facilities, schools, and other learning centers, cultural activities through multiple transportation modes. Since the focus plan was developed, Bob, you can go to the next slide. We have 17 sub areas, and each of those sub areas has an area plan developed. And I'm sure many of you have been involved in the area planning process. Each of those 17 areas has had at least one area plan update since focus, and some of them have had multiple area plan updates. And in addition to those area plans, we have a lot of other citywide plans and other sub area plans, and all the way down to corridor plans. So what we've done as part of this to look back to what we've done is pull out all the recommendations from all those plans. And you can see at top right, we have almost 2,000 recommendations that have been made over the past 25 years related from all those different plans. A lot of those are specifically related to transportation. And when we look at those, a vast majority of those relate to multimodal transportation or active transportation that is using walking, biking, or transit more predominantly than driving in the city. So what we want to do first off is look at one of those performance indicators. How have we done with the planning? Because a lot of the plans, all the plans generally say the same things. We want more walking, biking, transit use. We want to be more multimodal. We're going to be more sustainable. So we look back at some of the data over the past decade, and in 2010, in terms of commuting to work, just over 90% of Kansas Cityans drove their own private car to work, 90.9%. 3.7% used public transit, 2.1% walked, and 0.2% biked. And then another about 3% worked from home. So with all the planning we've done, we looked at what's been the impact of that, where have we gone? And when you jump forward to 2019, just prior to the COVID pandemic, we are again at just over 90% driving a car or truck, a slight decrease, so from 90.9% to 90.4%. But when you look at the multimodal transportation, actually public transit use is down about 40%, walking is slightly down, and biking is about the same. So the fewer people driving really comes from people working from home rather than using transit, walking, or biking. Another really important part of the planning that's been done, the focus plan, and what we're looking at today is equity. And equity, rightly so, has come to the forefront as a very important part of this planning process and all of our public discussions over the years. So we looked again at what has happened in equity in Kansas City, and what does it look like today? And these three maps show three different metrics. The one on the left is population living in poverty. So the dark red is higher percentage of people living in poverty. In the middle, the darker blue is a higher percentage of minority populations. And then on the right, the darker red is the percentage of people who don't have access to a car for transportation. So those people who are needing to use public transit, walking, or biking. And you can see these three areas where we have high poverty, high minority populations, and high percentage of people without access to cars all overlap in the same location. We know this isn't by accident. This is a map of the Homeowner Loan Corporation redlining, where they essentially made it difficult to invest in homes, buy homes in areas that were redlined, and those were traditionally areas that were segregated, where Black and Hispanic and other populations of color were living or even forced to live or excluded from other locations through deed covenants and other exclusionary zoning techniques. And we can see those areas that were redlined in Kansas City also largely align with those areas where we have poverty, high minority, and high percentage of people that don't have access to cars. So some of the outcomes of that, and what's really important when we talk about equity, is thinking about these outcomes. On the map on the left shows life expectancy. Dark red is lower life expectancy. Dark blue is highest life expectancy. And that dark red is a life expectancy of about 70 years. The dark blue is about 85 years. So in just a matter of a few blocks, that's a dramatic difference. And on the right, related to transportation and mobility, we're looking at fatal car crash rates. And that exact same area that we looked at that was redlined, the same area that has a low life expectancy, also has a very high rate of fatal car crashes per resident. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Travis to go over a little bit of what we've heard already.
So we've had a lot of feedback over the years through our transportation documents, the plans that we have, but also through the playbook. I think the first year or so, Bobby and Kyle, of engagement was really focused on some key topics. We asked a lot of different questions, and some of those questions also had to do with transportation. And the types of feedback that we got had to do with, our traffic signal system, the pedestrian infrastructure that we have or don't have, the idea of complete streets, which is making it so that you can walk, bike, use transit, and use other modes besides the car on a particular street, the speeds of our streets, what are we doing with public transit and how much is it going to cost? What are our signs like in terms of wayfinding and so on? How do we accommodate parking? How are we accommodating that? What do we do about maintenance? Transportation is deeply tied to development, or the form of development, and land use, which is something that we're going to talk to you about during our next session in August. But that's a key component. Lots of different things we heard feedback on. And so these are just some of the topics that we discussed. We also last month had a mobility conversation with people that we know are already interested in the topic of mobility and transportation. We shared with them a lot of what we shared with you all today so far in the presentation. And out of that, we asked some questions such as, why haven't we achieved our changes in how we move around in Kansas City? Why is everyone still using a car? What is it about our policies that needs to change? What's been happening? And so a lot of what we heard had to do with what you see here. It had to do with, how we get implementation of our projects, what changes in the process between recommending a project be built for transportation and then the actual project may be different than what was recommended. How do we accommodate universal design, which is thinking about people of all abilities and what they need to move back and forth, as well as this AT80 concept that they have in Canada, which is to focus on, again, it's all ages, but thinking specifically about what do you need when you're in elementary school? Some of that's what you also need when you're older. How do we accommodate all of that? What's the best way to do that? Maybe going forward, we need to focus on that. How do we make sure that we don't have displacement with some of our projects? Because that's a big issue. People worry about transportation improvements in their community, possibly driving them out of their community because it's attracting others. So there's lots of different things, as well as technology. And again, our land use patterns. How do we make decisions on what's going forth in terms of a transportation project? So we heard a lot of different things during that June mobility session. We want to build on that with you all today and focus on our mobility topics. Bobby?
Thank you. Yeah, so there's about 7 or 8 kind of generalized topics that we've grouped together that we'd like to discuss. Just run through them real quick. We're going to do some of them today and some of them in the meeting next month. So today we're going to be talking about street design, active transportation, public transit, and transportation and equity. And then next month at the meeting, we're going to talk about transportation and land use, freight, and regional mobility. So these are the basic topics. This should cover pretty much just about everything. However, the conversation is open and ongoing here and on our website. So we are, constantly ready to hear from you if you have other issues that you'd like to bring up or something that we may have omitted or, something that needs more focus. So with that said, today's discussion theme is how far should we go with mobility in Kansas City? Like I said, we're going to talk about street design, active transportation, public transit, and transportation equity. So in terms of participation, we're going to ask questions and we're going to have you pick sort of answers from a scale, but also please put your comments or questions in the chat and raise your hand to comment or ask a question. So there's going to be plenty of opportunity for folks to sort of freeform share, but also answer the sort of polling question. So the first one that I'm going to go through is street design. And the sort of central question that we've determined for street design, we kind of think everything flows from this idea to a certain degree. The question is, should Kansas City design lower speed roadways? Okay, so we're going to talk about some considerations that need to be taken into account and some things that we would need to do to achieve lower speed roadways. So this idea kind of comes from the fact, widely recognized now, that safer streets are part and parcel with slower streets. The data is clear that if you want to save lives and have a better environment for folks who are on the road, you need to lower speeds. And a lot of that is typically achieved through engineering. So the considerations that we wanted to take into account is, this is going to reduce the deaths of drivers, pedestrians, and cyclists. It's going to, and also seriously injured crashes. So it's going to make the roadways safer if we design them to be slower. It will also create a more pleasant environment for the people on the street. It's why you don't see street side cafes next to a highway, right? It's going to be nicer for folks to be there. It's going to be easier to incorporate pedestrian, bicycle, and scooter facilities. These are the, some of the multimodal transportation options that we've been hearing about through our engagement in area plans and other plans for the last 15 plus years, is that people do want this. And so that's why, part of the reason why we're asking this question. But another consideration is, right now, the way that streets are analyzed, driver frustration, driver delay, and speed are high priorities. And if you slow a street down, you're going to create more delay, you're going to reduce speeds, and that could increase driver frustration. Now, keep in mind, over about a 5-mile trip, if you drive 25 miles an hour versus 35 miles an hour, the difference in time is like 3 minutes or less. So this is the level, the marginal level of frustration that we're talking about. Just want to make sure that we're all clear on sort of the scope of what we're discussing. So what we'd need to do in order to achieve these lower speeds is right size the streets. A lot of times what leads to speeding is that you have more roadway capacity in terms of lanes than you do volume in terms of the number of people traveling down that street. That leads to speeding. So, these are commonly called road diets. Have you ever heard that phrase before? So, it'd be the equivalent of turning a 4-lane road into 1 lane in each direction with a center turn lane. That's a really common example of a road diet. A second thing we need to do is install more traffic calming. And we're talking about speed humps. We're talking about chicanes. We're talking about curb bump outs, making sure that, from a design perspective, that people have to take a full-on 90-degree turn and can't just sort of like ease through one of the slip lanes and things like that. That's another thing, is removing some of these high-speed turn lanes that just were designed when cars didn't have power steering, and to make it really easy to make a right turn. We've now, because of the driving technology, they wind up being more dangerous than they are useful. Another thing is reduce speed limits, and that's one of the way that we're framing this question. In addition to engineering the roadways to yield slower speed vehicles, reducing the speed limits to make it official is going to be a big part of this, would be a big part of this. Okay, and then in certain situations where it works and where it's contextually correct, would be to replace traffic signals with roundabouts. We've seen a lot of that in our neighbor communities, especially in Johnson County. They are very fond of the roundabout these days. And though I understand they can be frustrating, people typically do get used to them, and they typically do yield safer junctions. So,
Hey, Bobby.
The way that this question, oh, sorry.
There's some.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna take that back. Thank you. I know exactly what you're gonna say, I think. Did we miss anything? Are there considerations? Are there things that we would need to do that I did not mention? I would ask my colleagues to be able to mine the chat to bring anything up that I may have omitted.
So there's something in it. Marcus is getting a lot of love in the chat. And so there's
Okay,
some
let's go.
really great comments in there. And I saw something in there also about the size of emergency vehicles,
Okay.
because that often overrules a lot of what we're talking about in terms of street design.
I've
There are
heard
some-
that one go. I've heard that sword cuts both ways.
Mhm. There's some comments in there about having pedestrian zones. And also, how does all of the street design apply to considerations for our boulevards and our parkways? Because those are often wider and they're designed to be wider, and people drive a lot faster on those.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And then
Um,
also ADA considerations as well.
Yes. And generally, I think this would have a a slower speed street would have a positive outcome in terms of ADA accommodations. I think that's kind of, those two things work pretty complementary. Anything else? Just let me know when I'm clear to move on, because I've got so many screens going right now that I can't actually monitor the chat and the PowerPoint at the same time.
There's also a concern about the cost of this.
Okay.
Improvements like this.
Potentially.
Yeah, you know what's one of the considerations that we've thought about as well is so sometimes folks think about just the initial construction cost, but on a lower speed street, typically what you're going to see is the life cycle cost of that road can actually be lower over time. So, you know, it's kind of a buy once, cry once kind of situation, at least. So my dad says when he buys expensive tools.
Hey, Bobby, there was a question about the emergency vehicles, and you made a comment about how that comment cut both ways, and there was some question about what you meant by that. I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit.
So, you know, I've definitely heard folks say, oh, you can't do, you know, curb bump outs because, what is it? Like fire trucks can't make those turns, but supposedly they very much can, and they're very professional drivers. And it's not necessarily always the case that the emergency vehicles require a roadway to be built a certain way. On top of that, that also assumes that emergency vehicles will never change. You know, you're seeing smaller ambulances and better turning vehicles start to come off the line as this like older fleet starts to age out. So I think that those are considerations that we need to make as well. And when we're thinking about the design of roadways.
Yeah, and I think it's good to, when we think about the emergency vehicles, what kind of roadways those vehicles travel on today. A lot of the residential streets that fire trucks need to access throughout the city are very narrow, have narrow curb returns, and they're really designed to make those corners. They're designed to do that. So there might be some concern with that, but that's certainly a technical issue that can be overcome quite easily.
Yeah, and also I like to think of things like really fully understand the scope. Okay, so if a fire truck has to hop a curb once a year, I don't think that's necessarily a deal breaker. And we can, you know, we can accommodate that.
There's a lot of feedback in the chat. We are recording the meeting, so we're going to be able to grab comments that we are getting in the chat. Just to make a note, there's some also conversation in the chat about turn lanes and what the experience is for a driver when there aren't turn lanes.
Okay. Yeah.
You're thinking about
you know,
this.
and that's very contextual with the road and the volumes and everything, and operations considerations are huge, but yeah, I guess it kind of depends on the situation. But yeah, I mean, those are considerations that would go through, and you know, we're thinking of things like this in terms of like a high level policy, but also, you know, following professional engineering standards as these things are, as you know, these designs are applied in the various contexts throughout the city. You know, operations are always something that's going to be taken into consideration, you know, weighed heavily.
And there's some comment in the chat too about the guidelines and changing them, and you know what guidance is followed in order to design the streets that we have. But with that conversation, do you want to go to your next slide?
Sure. Okay, so yeah, the design guidance is something that should be explored more. We do, you know, our engineers and are allowed to use other design guidance by ordinance. So it's just, that is something that we're already working on, but hopefully we can use this plan to bolster that. Okay, so we're gonna poll put up a poll question, and we want you to vote 1 through 5. How aggressive should Kansas City be in designing lower speed roadways? So 1, not aggressive at all, no change. Keep it the same, status quo is great, don't move. 2, slightly aggressive. That would look like reducing speeds only in residential areas, right? So like we just saw, for instance, New York City rolled out a 20 is plenty campaign on residential streets, something along those lines. 3, moderately aggressive. Reduce speeds in residential areas and then target some higher crash, more dangerous areas. You can be, that's, it kind of starts to touch towards the Vision Zero model, where you're really, you're targeting using data. 4, a little bit more aggressive. Reduce speeds in residential areas, high crash areas, and other targeted areas where we want to create a safer space, right? We're not just being reactive, we're also being proactive to make something a slower speed, nicer street to be on. And then 5, very aggressive. We're saying citywide, we just need to do everything we can to slow speeds down. Everybody drives too fast. So if we could get the poll popped up. Thank you, B. So yeah, as much as I hate to hear my own voice, I'm going to repeat this. Okay, 1 is not at all aggressive. 2, slightly aggressive. That's kind of thinking residential streets only. 3, moderately aggressive. That's reducing speeds in residential areas and high crash areas, very targeted. 4, residential areas, high crash areas, and places that we sort of want to, we're endeavoring to make slower traffic. And 5, very aggressive, reduce speeds on all streets in the city, you know. So I'm waiting to hear, I'm sure that when the cake is baked, it'll come out of the oven in terms of poll questions being done.
And I wanted to mention, as you all think about this and answer the question, try to think about your experience on the street and what you want it to look like. Don't think about the technical challenges, difficulties, or what we might need to do. That's really something that we and our team and the city planners and engineers and looking at the best practices and how we can do this. So it's really a matter of what do you want the city to look like, more so what you think is possible based on the technical aspects of it.
I'm going to go ahead and end the polling now, Bobby,
Cool.
and share the results.
Okie doke. Well, okay. I mean, I think that the if you add up 3 through 5, we've got 20, 40, probably like 89% of people are in this moderately aggressive to very aggressive area, with number 4, reduce speeds in residential areas, high crash areas, and other targeted areas coming in as the overwhelming favorite. Very interesting. I'm very curious about these results. We were going to try to do, are we still looking good on time to be able to say, hey, if someone voted in a certain way and wants to explain their vote, we'd love to hear from you. Can we still make that happen?
Yep, I think we have a couple of minutes that we could do that. And you could also put in the chat, you all.
Yep. We'll have to keep that to about 2 minutes as we go forward.
Yes, sir. Thank you for the heads up. If anyone is, you know, if anyone's feeling it and wants to talk, I would love to invite you to explain why you answered how you answered.
There's a hand up in attendees.
Okay.
Can't see it all. Let's see.
All right, I have allowed this person to speak.
I suggested, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I suggested number 4 for many reasons. I'm 65, so I pretty well know what's been going on in Kansas City more years than probably are people that are running the meeting today. But the speeds need to be changed here in the residential areas because of the way people like to speed around and swashbuckle their vehicles now, because they do it on Prospect every day. So that's one reason they should reduce the speeds, not because of Prospect, because they do it all over the city now. The second reason is because the high crash areas. We're having areas of the city now where this type of activity that I mentioned before and now didn't happen, but it's ongoingly. And particularly since the pandemic started, people are driving like they've lost their mind. And then there are a lot of other areas in the city that need to be targeted, because even in areas where somebody's talking about it now, where children, where the crosswalks are, people are ignoring the signs. So
Thank
maybe
you very much.
if things start changing a little bit more, people will start trying to change as well. But
Okay.
they definitely need to work on the speeds in Kansas City. Definitely.
Thank you. We really appreciate your answer. And I think that's good that you came in as representative of the most common answer.
Bobby, we
think
have a
that's
couple
got
more
us-
raised hands. if you
Yeah,
have a
we're
sec.
I want to make sure that we get to every single question. And I know this one's probably, we kind of came in hot with a good question. Do we have time for one more, guys?
I think you can do one more.
Bobby.
One more. Okay. And if you don't mind, whoever is the speaker, if you don't mind being as brief as you can.
Alexa, go ahead and speak.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
All right, so I actually go to Oak Park High School, and speaking for, I said this in the chat too, speaking for a lot of high school students, as a teenager, a lot of people that attend high school, a lot of teenagers like to speed around when they drive. Plus, we're also new drivers, and I know through residential areas, especially ones without a lot of speed bumps, and speaking for the cars that kind of park in the street, a lot of kids my age will speed down those roads. So I think speed bumps would be a really, really good solution to that problem. As for, highways, that's kind of why I answer number 3, because I think residential areas need to be targeted the most. But I really don't really know what to say about highway speeds, because I think they're fine the way they are, especially on ones that aren't necessarily high crash areas. But I think the areas that need to be targeted the most are residential areas.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you
No problem.
speaking up.
Thanks, Alexa.
Okay, so that was awesome. I really appreciate y'all. Hope this is working really well, I think. And we're going to move on to the next question, which will be run by Mr. J.
Thanks, Bobby. So the next question is about active transportation. And when we say active transportation, that's really any transportation that requires you personally to be active. So that's walking, jogging, biking, scootering, skateboarding, any manner of thing that requires you to be active to move around. But of course, we don't want to make the question too long, talking about all these different active transportation modes. So we shortened it a little bit to say, should Kansas City focus on pedestrian, bike, and scooter infrastructure? Go to the next slide, Bobby. Perfect. And so like Bobby did with the last one, we go through some of these considerations that we thought through as a group and then ask for your input. So when we say that, ask the question, should Kansas City focus on pedestrian, bike, and scooter infrastructure? Some of the things that might mean is that this may reduce deaths of drivers, pedestrians, and cyclists. And we want to make sure we mention drivers as well. Most pedestrian bicycle infrastructure also have safety benefits for drivers. It may lower greenhouse gas emissions, leading to less climate change and more sustainable transportation because we have fewer people driving. It may improve transportation equity because, as we saw earlier, when we looked at those maps of where people didn't have access to motor vehicles, to cars to drive, they're relying on walking, biking, using scooters, especially to access transit to get around. So if we provide better and safer facilities for them, that improves equity. This may support transit, first mile, last mile connections from home to the transit stop to the bus stop. But it also may make streets less fast or convenient for drivers. So what we need to do to accomplish this, and again, this is just a small list, there's a lot of other strategies and action items that would be required to accomplish this, but just kind of some highlights. What we need to do, we need to construct more mobility lanes, so bicycle lanes, but also for scooters or those other modes, those faster modes, electric skateboards, all those things. So mobility lanes and sidewalks. And of course, with sidewalks, handicap accessible ramps and all those additional universal design elements. We need to revise standards to incorporate complete streets. That would be all the street design standards, the subdivision regulations, all the things that dictate how our streets get made. And we would have to revise those. Again, we need to right size the streets, reduce the number of lanes where there's excess capacity on the road using road diets or narrowing lanes to make it appropriate for vehicles. And we'd also need to educate drivers, but not just drivers, also cyclists and pedestrians and scooter riders too, as to where it's appropriate for them to operate. So with that, I want to ask on these considerations, if there's anything we missed, anything else add to the list. I see we have a lot of chat bubbles popping up here.
Hey, we do. And for those of you who are using the chat, we really appreciate your comments. We love them to go to everyone. So in your 2 options in the chat, there's a drop-down menu and it says everyone. Would you click that? I think some of y'all are chatting just the host and the panelists, and that's great, but we want everyone to see your wonderful comments. So if you click everyone, that would be really helpful.
Travis, sorry to interrupt you. It actually lists it as all panelists and attendees. That's the option they should select. But once you start chatting, it says to everyone. I think, unless I'm wrong, somebody correct me. That's what it shows on mine.
All panelists and attendees or everyone. So what's missing so far, do you think? What have we not accounted for?
I see one comment here about streets being narrowed and being difficult to bike on. Because the streets are narrower, there's less room to bike next to cars, and side swiping of vehicles is common. That's certainly a concern. I think with the intention of this would be to construct those not the shared spaces, but the separated spaces where we have actual infrastructure dedicated to cycling, to using scooters and to walking, so that there isn't that mixing of drivers and cars and bicycles in a very dangerous situation.
We've had a couple of instances of folks pointing out that parking for bikes and scooters and stuff is key to adoption, which I duly noted to those folks who mentioned that.
Very good. I see also about not lumping in
education.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Becca.
But not lumping in bike and scooter and pedestrian together. I think that's something we've heard a lot about. We don't want scooters on the sidewalk. We don't want pedestrians in the bicycle lanes, and keep all those modes separated. It's a great point. Educate all users on the roadways. Yep, excellent.
And drivers not always obeying the rules of the road either. Lots of support for, we got an absolutely with all caps for segregating modes. Do you want to go to the voting? That's the poll question.
Yeah, I think we can go on to voting. So like the last scale, we go from not at all aggressive to very aggressive. And we frame this in terms of projects. So transportation mobility projects. And that's a kind of a simplified way to think about it. You could think about it in other ways, but this is kind of an easy way to talk about this. So we ask, how aggressive should Kansas City be in focusing on pedestrian, bike, and scooter infrastructure? We can say choice 1, not at all aggressive, is no change. Again, status quo, exactly what we have in Kansas City is what we should strive for the next 20 years. Slightly aggressive, we said
quick,
up to 20.
Jay, can we be
Yeah,
clear
ahead,
about
Billy.
what the status quo is? It's probably in the like 1% range.
Yeah, so if we look at the projects we're doing today, it's likely around 1 or 2% of our projects are dedicated to bicycling, walking, or scooter infrastructure. We do have some more with the GO bond funds that is primarily related to addressing past 311 call issues and deferred maintenance issues. But in terms of new capital projects, it's a very small amount. So slightly aggressive, up to 20% of projects should be bike, pedestrian, scooter focused. Again, that's a large increase of what we have now. Moderately aggressive, up to 40% of projects, bicycle, pedestrian, scooter focused. Aggressive is up to 60% of projects, and very aggressive, up to 80% of projects should be bicycle, pedestrian, and scooter focused. And I do see a question. There is a question about whether or not this includes transit. This does not include transit. Transit is actually our next thing we'll talk about. Somebody asked, are scooters here to stay, or are they a fad? I think they're certainly here to stay. A lot of data from more walkable, more bikeable cities is that scooter usage is actually becoming much more prevalent than bicycle usage. So a lot of those short trips on bicycles and even on transit are being replaced with scooter trips. So they're definitely here to stay, like it or not. They're definitely here for the long term.
A friend of mine who's a transportation planner in Washington, D.C., they kind of determined once they got a certain like sort of minimum grid of bike lanes essentially in Washington, D.C., scooter trips just went up exponentially and kind of took over for bikes to a certain extent. It was really fascinating to see.
Got about 9 people who haven't voted yet. I'm going to give it about 20 more seconds here.
Seeing a couple of mentions of the folks would like to see a 10% option. That's we'll make note of that.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll now and share the results.
Excellent, very good. So a little bit more moderate than our last answers. Last one we were really focused on that 3, 4, and 5 of moderate to very aggressive. Here we're a little bit more middle of the road, from slightly aggressive to aggressive, but still a desire to do much more than what we're doing today. Does anybody have any comments, questions about, or like to expand on why you voted for one of these?
Yeah, it looks like Rob Collins has a comment. Rob, if you raise your hand, I will allow you to talk. I saw your hand, it disappeared. There you go. All right, Rob, you're good to go. I'm promoting you so you could speak.
And if you're talking, Rob, we can't hear you. You might be on mute still.
There we go. Is my mic working now?
Yep, we can hear you.
Hello?
We can hear you, Rob.
Okay. So I was wondering if part of the scooter and bike lanes would also accommodate larger vehicles like the senior mobility scooters and motorized wheelchairs.
I think typically, I think they could. I don't know the exact requirements of law of how those operate in terms of what they're considered legally on the roadway. There are specific laws governing where you can ride a bike, where you can ride a scooter, where you can walk, and those things. I think in practice, with wider mobility lanes, that would be something that would be accessible to people. But I don't know that it would be explicitly legal unless that was made to be so with the city ordinances. I think, though, in general, when we talk about this as well, we need to think about those universal design concepts. And of course, we're not just talking about bicycle and scooter infrastructure or mobility lanes. We're talking about sidewalks and ADA ramps and trails and all those other features that can also be utilized by mobility impaired individuals. So really, it's about all those users.
Thank you. I will
All right.
go
Thanks,
to another
Rob.
if we have any others. It looks like that was it for now.
Excellent. Let's go on to our next one. So somebody had mentioned transit in our last ones. You were ahead of the curve. Now we are going to talk about transit. And when we're talking about transit, we're talking about all forms of transit, whether that's the streetcar, Ride KC buses, paratransit, microtransit, all those aspects. So the question is, should Kansas City actively pursue policies that make public transit more useful? And we say more useful, we want it to be more convenient, have more coverage, provide more access to more people, get you places quicker, and just in general be a usable service to our citizens. So again, some of those aspects we've thought of, not certainly a comprehensive list, but just some kind of highlights. When we ask this question, we think this may reduce congestion from drivers. If we have fewer cars on the roads, more people in transit vehicles, we have less congestion on the roadways. It may also lower greenhouse gas emissions. Again, fewer cars on the road, fewer vehicles, creating greenhouse gases, more sustainable, help mitigate the climate change. It may also improve transportation equity back to the people that don't have access to vehicles. If they have a better transit system, they can get to their jobs easier, they can get around town easier, get to essential city services or grocery stores easier. This may necessitate transit lines or stops on more streets. Some people see that as a positive, other people see that as a negative. If they don't want a transit line or a transit stop on their street in front of their house, for example, but more coverage would necessitate more transit lines and stops on more streets. And it may also make streets less fast and convenient for drivers. Again, if we're using things like bus only lanes or transit signal priority, it may make it less convenient for drivers. At the same time, there may be some mitigating impact from that reduced congestion from fewer cars on the road. So when we think about what we need to do to accomplish this, we would need to increase frequency and coverage for all transit service. We need to expand max service lines. So like the main, Troost and Prospect max lines, expand those to more areas in the city, east and north from where they are now. We may need to use transit priority lanes, repurpose general drive lanes for cars to be for transit vehicles only all day, or maybe just part of the day. This was done at some point on Main Street in limited fashion. We may need to expand that. We may need to also focus again on that bicycle, pedestrian, scooter infrastructure of constructing the first and last mile connectivity. So how do you get to the bus? Everyone riding a transit vehicle is a pedestrian, a cyclist, scooter rider when they begin or end their trip. All right, so any other considerations that you all wanted to mention? I think I see an active chat box, which is really awesome. We're loving all this feedback from you all.
There's comments in there about design dictating what people use and level of comfort and convenience, importance of having connectivity in a really connected system instead of focusing on one particular mode, and what the impact of free transit has had on Kansas City, as well as what happens when we streamline that system and take away bus stops, particularly if you're older, what the impact of that is on you. Being context sensitive is in the chat. And there's also an earlier comment about thinking about not so much what projects are we focusing on, but what type of transportation, maybe behavior, do we want to have people using? So are they going to be, more readily walking and biking and using transit because that's easier for them? Let's say sometimes you would call that a shift in mode of transportation that they're taking. Should we be thinking about that instead of the proportion of projects that we build?
And we went round and round about this a bit, just how to frame the question properly, and like mode shift being the goal is great, but that's kind of like a little bit more advanced for kind of like general folks off the street to wrap their head around to a certain degree. But also, those mode shift goals don't ever get attained without the projects being built. So the idea is like, if we're going to do 100 projects in a year, what percent of them are going to be? It really kind of gets to our focus in terms of where we're putting our priorities, right? And these things aren't mutually exclusive or whatever by any means, but yeah, with the goal of a mode shift goal would be part of this, but the idea is just to be able to sort of a proxy for priorities.
Mm-hmm. So there
was also a comment in there about portions of the city, different portions of the city needing different solutions as well. So that fits in well with the context sensitive conversation as well. The solution needs to fit the context as well.
And
as well as,
question number 4 is coming in hot. Don't worry about that.
Yep, ties to economic development incentives. Economic
I want to
plus
address a
transit is also in
question
there.
from Brad. Brad says, what percentage of citizens use KCATA today, and does it justify the investment? And I think this is actually Bobby's analogy that I'm stealing, is that we didn't build a bridge over the Missouri River because there was a lot of people swimming over it. We built a bridge because we wanted to have access to the other side, and we wanted to drive that access and use that to better the citizens' lives and economic development and all those other aspects. So right now, our bus system in the city, our transit systems in general, are not particularly robust when you look at cities that have high transit usage. And so it makes sense that a lot of people are driving because they don't have the connectivity, they don't have the connections. And like some people have mentioned here, they might not need to be going to work in the peak hours. They might need to be going to a doctor's office or something in the middle of the day, and we don't have that transit service. So it's not really a question of how many people are using transit today. It's how many people do we want to use transit? What is the priority of our city? Where do we want our city to look like? And again, when we talk about getting people out of their cars and into a transit vehicle, that mode shift, and if we want to shift that and get more people riding transit, that's going to take investment, that's going to take projects. So we framed it in that way. So this really is a question of, what do you want the city to look like, not what does it look like today? This is that future vision, those future goals.
And then thinking about what that future vision is, there is a comment in the chat about just the size of our city, I would say, because sometimes your trip could take an hour and a half, depending on where you are starting and where you want to go inside the city. So we also need to think about that. Do you want to?
Yep, let's go to the question. So here's a question framed in the same way as the last one in terms of projects. But again, you can think of this as a project could be, building a new MAX line. It could be expanding transit. Just generally, saying projects is somewhat a proxy for investment, funding, and how aggressive you want the city to be in terms of incentivizing the use of transit, improving the use of transit, and making it accessible to all of our citizens. So not at all aggressive is no change. Essentially keep the system exactly as we have it today. Slightly aggressive, up to 20% of projects transit focused, moderately aggressive up to 40%, aggressive up to 60%, very aggressive up to 80%. And I think, again, the exact percentages are probably less important than really how aggressive you want the city to be. I know
Jay, do you mind clarifying what is reference when you say percentage of projects? What do you mean by projects? Is that all construction, all infrastructure projects? We had some questions in the chat about that.
Yeah, I think that's generally the idea. When we think about what infrastructure projects we're doing or what kind of funding we're allocating to transportation and mobility in general, if you want to spend 60% of our transportation funding on projects that support transit, on transit itself, operating costs, those types of costs, I think that's really what we're getting at. So do you want to spend 60%? Do you want to spend 40%? Do you want to spend 20% of the money in the city and the projects focused on improving transit?
It looks like we're almost done and got about 8 votes left. So I'm going to give it about 10 more seconds here and then I'll end the polling.
And there is some question in the chat for those who are still voting about what our baseline is. I think for a lot of this, we are not moderate, and often we're slightly aggressive or maybe no change on a lot of these. Bobby or Jay, do you want to elaborate?
Yeah, I think in general, we do very, the vast majority of our spending on transportation is focused on driving infrastructure, streets for cars to drive on. I don't have the exact numbers of the budget in front of me, but it would be a small percentage for all multimodal transportation, including bicycle, pedestrian, transit, the share of money going to transit for operating and capital expenditures, I think is less than 10% of what we spend on transportation projects.
Yeah, and there's a lot of inside details associated with rules we've placed on ourselves as a society where certain federal funds can only go towards buying buses. We can't go towards operating that buses. Don't worry about that stuff. We're thinking about this in terms of where we're trying to set our sights, how aggressively we're trying to pursue a vision. And the percent is like I said, a proxy of that idea. So, I know it might be weird to say this, but don't get too bogged down in the details in particular, but in terms of just like, how are we trying to prioritize this relative to other things? There's a lot of details there, but still we can talk about this in those terms. And I appreciate it. A lot of people out there have great knowledge about these things, and I like the engagement, and folks want to dig deep, and that's awesome. This is just, like I said, a proxy for where our priorities lie.
And really, this is, again, very early in our process. A lot of these things like mode shift, exact baselining of how much we're spending today, how much other cities are spending, other competitive cities are spending, are all going to be part of this process. But again, this is the first strategy session. So as Bobby said, this is kind of a gauge of how aggressive we want to be rather than getting into those details, which will come later in the process. And it looks like we have a little bit more voting on the aggressive side compared to the previous two. Most of you said you want us to be very aggressive with promoting public transit, and the majority of people in that moderately aggressive to very aggressive frame, and not very many people voting for no change or keep doing what we're doing today.
And I feel obligated to make a note that these questions and the way that they're framed are born from 15 plus years of area planning, and that those area plans are built on a foundation of public engagement. So this lines up with what we've been hearing, asking these questions and framing them in this way. And the result of, we are hearing people, we want you to be more aggressive about transit. So what we're trying to do is essentially take what we've been hearing and make sure that we can bolster that with these conversations and craft policies that suit that outlook. So I just wanted to make sure everybody's aware that this is essentially driven from engagement that's been done for a very long time.
Hey, Bobby, there is a hand up.
Oh,
if we have a
awesome.
second. Allison,
Yeah,
Allison, you are able to talk now if you unmute yourself.
Hi there. I didn't know if you were taking comments on this one, but I was going to reflect that I voted for very aggressive because I'm hoping that the transit sector and transit projects can include the land use side of things. So thinking about transit-oriented development, I saw some comments in the chat about how can we possibly cover all the destinations in such a sprawled metro region. So I think if we can dedicate budget, whether it's a transit budget specifically or just the city budget at large toward the development side to sort of complement transit network would be great.
Thanks,
awesome.
Allison.
Thank you, Allison. That was a great comment. And I wanted to put a plug in for our next strategy session. Land use and linking land use and transportation is actually something we're going to discuss in a very similar manner as we are now at our next session at the end of August. So I hope you can make it to that one as well, but that's definitely a really important concern for us.
So our last topic that we'd like to talk to you about is transportation equity. We talked to you about all the recommendations that we have just in summary and what areas have been impacted or not impacted by those recommendations. And there really hasn't been a lot of positive change in areas that have gone through redlining and have had covenants that have people of color in them and so on. So we're wanting to know, should Kansas City allocate funding citywide based on targeted equity priority areas? So look at the next slide. That could involve lots of different things, like correcting the negative racist effects of our past transportation projects. And we know there have been a lot of concerns. People worry about what the impact of some of our projects has been in the past, as well as what it could be when we think about the future. Again, I mentioned before, even in the earlier comments, people were worried about gentrification and displacement. We also know if we were to target in this way, we might be able to more quickly address some of the worst inequities in specific areas. Jay already showed you data about life expectancy and fatalities and where those are. Those locations also line up with where there have been a lot of restrictions based on race. We could also then impact the number of deaths that are happening in those areas if we start to target where we've had the most issues. We could also then stop or postpone projects in other parts of the city that aren't in these targeted areas. So there's a little bit of a trade-off there. In order to do that, we would need to identify where are our equity priority areas and what are those needs, what types of transportation projects would be a benefit to those communities and those community members. It also means shifting our priorities again to certain locations instead of spreading it out all over the city to do a little bit somewhere and a little bit somewhere else, being very targeted and allocating funding and projects and improvements to those areas. And again, displacement. So those are some of the things that come to mind quickly when we think about transportation equity and what's involved with it. But that's just, I would probably argue, the tip of the iceberg. And I know that you all have other thoughts as it relates to equity and transportation. What does it mean then if we were to target? What will we need to do and what might be some of the impacts of that? And I can see some of your comments in the chat. See anything that receives public support should have significant and responsible management, including environmental stewardship, based on what are the impacts there. Black and brown neighborhoods experience pedestrian facilities at a disproportionate rate, and so we have to improve the pedestrian infrastructure as well as transit access in those areas. That could be difficult. I see Laura's commenting that way in the chat, to be able to create equity in targeted areas when there are other municipalities that have, gotten out of that situation or in participation. Regarding that, what else?
Andrea commented that using the environmental justice tracks might be a good place to start in order to target equity priority areas.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. So comment in there about the redlining areas and making sure populations are included in the planning and the rollout of specific projects so that they're not more harmed than good is done to them. And then thinking about restorative and inclusive priorities. That's getting a second in the chat. And then Jay's dropped a resource from the Mid-America Regional Council that shows some of our peer cities in relationship to transit and spending and ridership and who's on those buses and using those systems. And there's some in the chat about how funding's used and how city councils never target 3rd and 5th districts to make up for previous lack of investment. This topic, I know it can be, it's a little bit frustrating, but there's a lot of potential if community as a whole can make a decision about how to go about addressing the issues. We know in the past, just like is in the chat, that hasn't been the case. But if we think about our 2040, what can we do to make that better? And not continuing along the same path is a step in doing that. Making a choice to target instead of leaving out is a choice. Something else in the chat is that one of the principal aspects of inequity in transportation is the problem of transportation to areas outside of Kansas City. Until one improves the governance of transit in the region as a whole, we will have to be content with half measures. I see that in the chat.
Stay tuned for the next episode, Mark.
I see in the chat, Bob is asking, what if we ask the targeted areas what they want done in the area around them? And that's what we want to do. We also want to know, is it okay? How do you feel about targeting? And then where are those, what areas are we targeting? What characteristics, what are their needs? All of that. There's also in the chat looking at East and West movement and not just wealthier neighborhood connectivity and giving, thinking about scheduling and local community demands as we think about that. Let me see what we can get in terms of response about aggressiveness. Bobby, can we go to the next slide? So how aggressive should Kansas City be in allocating funding based on targeted equity priority areas? We could do nothing like we've been doing right now, so not at all aggressive, so no change. We could be number 2, slightly aggressive. And again, this is project-based again. So where might these improvements go, considering you have conversations with community members, you've maybe defined the framework for what it means to be a targeted equity priority area. We're thinking broadly about how we do our projects and where they are. And even though it's a challenge, what proportion would you might assign to that? And if that language is difficult, just go with, is this something that we should pursue in a slightly aggressive matter, in a moderately middle of the road aggressive matter, an aggressive matter, or really aggressive? What should we do about that? It would be a real change compared to how things are done now. I see a chat, something in the chat from Brad. Hannah, did you, or not Hannah, Becca, did you see Brad's comment? It's getting some seconds in the chat.
I think Brad was
I
talking
see it.
about, he says, make it better, quit pouring money into downtown. And a lot of the other comments are about, yes, putting money, investing money into other parts of the city rather than in downtown, distributing that through the city.
Thanks, Jay.
Yep, thank you.
About 7 more votes left, so I'm going to give it about 15 seconds here and I'll close the polling.
So a lot of seconds for Brad's comment. I also see hire local Black and brown design and construction companies. And lots of comment about that. Not just focusing on downtown.
I'm going to go ahead and end the polling and share the results.
Okay, this is a little bit different than some of the others. We're more trending towards aggressive than away from it. Would someone elaborate on why you voted the way that you voted? If you want to do that, just raise your hand and we can see it raised, and then Beth will call your name and allow you to share your voice with us. While she's looking at that, go ahead.
Yeah, Gigi Owens, I'm going to go ahead and allow to speak. Go ahead.
We have watched for many years in Kansas City, as someone brought up 3rd and 5th District. There are other areas of Kansas City, but the focus now needs to get off of downtown. Downtown made their big power move and they came back and they rebuilt the entire downtown area. But the downtown is not the most important area of Kansas City. We have to start thinking about the residents. Who are the people who are spending money to come downtown and keep those businesses open? If you don't start investing in the rest of the city, why should anybody think about going downtown? When they can look around and see nothing is changing. Secondly, the city has to stay on top of the HRD requirements on making sure that people of color as well as females are involved in the projects. We have to stop the good old boy network activity. It's not working. And eventually, as we see not only across the country or the world, people are going to start gathering and show their concerns. And if they don't want to start seeing that here, things have got to change. Change has got to come. So it's good that you're talking about this, but I'm going to recommend that you start going to these communities to actually hear from the people who may not have internet or even know these meetings are going on. Everybody does not have internet. Everybody does not have computers, and everybody's not going to get on their phone and take time to do this. Break it back down and go to the communities. And flyers, even if it seems old school to people, people look at those things in posters who do not have computers and access to internet.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Owens.
You're welcome.
We have time for maybe 1 or 2 more people, maybe. Does anyone else have their hand up, Beth?
Looks like that's all for now.
Okay.
We've got about 10 more minutes.
10 minutes left, so yep.
Okay, so I see in the chat, it's hard to say that you're from, I think this is Jonathan. It's hard to say that you're trying to fix inequities when you focus on developing bus, bike, and ped projects in Black and brown communities, but still promote driving related to projects in wider communities. We need to be very aggressive toward promoting bus and non-personal vehicles and transportation methods. Thank you for everyone who gave your thoughts in relationship to transportation equity, as well as what our public transportation system is, how we design our streets, and so on. We'd really love today to learn from you what you think mobility should mean in 2040 based on everything that we've been talking about. I see in the chat, it might be connection to work, friends, family, health, food, community. Also, mobility could mean who has access to where, and that maybe that's our motto. That's from Andrea in the chat. I see publicity builds pipelines. Mobility might mean access. Kudos for using mobility as the language instead of transportation. Able to get where you want to go with or without a car is in the chat. There's a second for mobility equaling connection. And through the whole process, we need to be sure that we are deliberately, purposefully, and authentically getting feedback from everyone about what this means. And I see capital letters, make mobility go everywhere. And that it's access and not transportation. And that's what was learned in focus. Mobility is also the, you can choose effectively. You can choose the mode that fits your life circumstances. And with that, I know that Kyle promised an early release, and it's 7 minutes until 5. So if you all are still answering that question, please do so in the chat. And I will give it back to Kyle and Bobby to close.
We want to thank everybody for joining us. And I know there was a lot of comments in the chats that it may feel like we didn't address. And that's kind of this platform is set up this way so that we can get those and we can comment back to those that we can. Please bear with us as we're trying to work through those communities that don't have access to computers. And the digital divide is something real that we've struggled with all the time through this COVID process. It is something that we will get to. We have advertised on the radio, we've advertised on billboards, we've advertised on buses, we've done flyers and pamphlets. One of the things we would love to ask you guys to do as well is, if you're still on the chats, put other ways that we can communicate with your neighborhoods, and please let them know that we want to hear from them as well. Please come back to our other meetings. We have many, many more on these topics and others. With that, I will hand it actually over to Gerald Williams, who is staff that's managing this project, and see if he has any closeouts for us.
No, I think you've all covered it, and thank you all for being here. Great conversation, and all these comments are just you're all very thoughtful. It's going to be good for us to use as we move forward. And this is the beginning of a series of meetings and processes, and there'll be I don't know if we've mentioned this too much, but a few other topics coming up as well this fall. So this is sort of an ongoing discussion about mobility and other topics. And you know, if you aren't already on our website and registered and receiving emails, please get plugged in so you can stay involved in the conversation. And we've got a visibility meeting coming up next week on August the 5th. On Zoom again. I believe this is also at 3:30. And again, visibility is dealing with topics like urban design and public realm and public spaces and parks and open spaces and things that you see, you know, in the built environment, both private development and in the public spaces as well. So if you have an interest in that conversation, it'll be a similar format to what you just saw today, and we'd love to have you there. And again, thank you all for being here.
Thanks, everyone. Great
Appreciate
feedback.
everybody. Yeah, don't forget the next meeting, Marcus, is August 26th. So we got about a month out. It's going to be, again, from 3:30 to 5. And then keep us on your radar for future meetings. We really do appreciate everyone joining on. And we look forward to hearing from you again soon. Thanks.
Keep an eye on Playbook website.
Playbook.kcmo.
Yep. Somebody asked where to look for the link. Sign up for newsletters. We'll send you information via newsletters, but also just check the website, bookmark it, check it often. We'll have all the latest meetings posted there. Thank you, everybody.